With news of a terrorist attack in which 3 people were murdered and 6 others wounded, one seriously as Palestinian terrorists opened fire at a bus and several vehicles near Kedumim in Judea and Samaria. The victims include 2 women in their 60s and a policeman in his 40s. The 63-year-old bus driver remains in serious condition. The attack was carried out on a main road which is shared by both Israelis and Palestinians. So much for claims of apartheid. Security forces rushed to the scene and launched a manhunt for the attackers, believed to include more than 1 terrorist. Following the attack, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a statement offering condolences to the families of the victims and pledged that Israel will reach the despicable murderers and bring them to justice, along with everyone who helped them. He added, "No one will be spared." And the emotional highs and lows of reported progress in the hostage for ceasefire talks have reached new levels of cruelty for the families of those 100 Israelis still being held captive by Hamas in Gaza. A Saudi news outlet today published the names of 34 hostages to allegedly be returned, without indicating which of the hostages are living and which are dead. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz tries to separate fact from fiction.
The cruel rumor mill connected with the hostage for ceasefire agreement is working overtime. A Saudi newspaper today published a list of captives to be freed, but does not differentiate between the living and the dead. The list includes the 2 Bibas children, 10 women, 11 older men, and 11 men under age 50. Earlier, a news report by Reuters said Hamas had approved the list of 34 Israeli hostages to be released in the first phase of the deal. Shortly after that report gained momentum, the Prime Minister's office denied that any such list has been received. The report went on to quote Hamas, saying the deal was still contingent on reaching an agreement for an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a permanent ceasefire. Prime Minister Netanyahu convened key ministers amid reports of progress in the talks. A Saudi report quotes sources saying an agreement could be clinched on key issues before Donald Trump takes office on January 20th. Indeed, there's speculation that the agreement could still be reached in the final days of the Biden administration. Secretary of State Blinken has been encouraging that speculation. A Palestinian source told a Qatari newspaper that the coming days would be decisive for hostage talks in Doha. Israeli officials say they still doubt that Hamas will agree to release all of the hostages in a second and third phase of a potential agreement unless Israel guarantees an end to the war. Israel has made no such commitment.
And joining us now with more on the hostage negotiations is Ambassador Daniel Sheikh, head of diplomacy at the Forum of the Families of the Hostages. Thank you so much for joining us today. You know, this is really an emotional roller coaster, especially for the families of the hostages. It seems every time we're close to a deal, every time the media reports on a deal, at the very last moment, Hamas backs out. You know, is this a deliberate strategy on their part to try and demoralize Israelis, demoralize the families, part of, the psychological warfare?
I have enough trouble figuring out the position of the Israeli government, so it's really difficult for me to do the same for the Hamas leadership. Obviously, they are not the most convenient negotiating partners that we could have chosen. I think there's a degree of lack of goodwill on both sides during the last few months. I don't think that Hamas was the only reason for the disappointments of the past few months. I often say, I've participated in many negotiations in my previous career. Comes a moment in every such negotiation where it's no longer about the content of the agreement. Everybody more or less knows what the outlines of that agreement will be. So yes, there's, the details are always very important, and sometimes a negotiation can fail because of what seems to be a small detail. But by and large, we know how the agreement will look. So what is necessary, what is lacking? It's that point in time where both sides at the same moment are really interested in succeeding. And apparently we haven't reached that point until now. I'm hopeful that we are close.
You know, we have exactly 2 weeks until President-elect Trump takes office. Now, he's made very clear that if the hostages are not returned by then, there will be a hell to pay. Do you think this is having any effect on the negotiations, on Hamas at all? I mean, will it help to reach that critical point in time?
Look, the Americans are not just bystanders. They are part of the negotiation. They're part of the mediators. They're actually sitting at the table, which is a very unique position for a Western power. And we know for a fact that on this particular issue of the hostage negotiation and the ceasefire negotiation, the outgoing and incoming administrations have been collaborating, which is excellent. We had hoped for that at the forum from the beginning, from after the election results were published. But again, you know, we're a very short time out before January 20. We're very hopeful that complete deal would be concluded by then. It still can.
Now, the Biden administration has put significant pressure on Israel. You know, Blinken recently said that this was the case and that whenever Hamas saw that there was pressure on Israel, it would back out of the deal. So what is your take on this?
You know, since we are not privy to the details of the negotiation, we're not part of it. We're a civil society organization, not beyond that. I don't know what exactly goes on around the negotiating table, but in a sense, it's a black and white issue. If the 100 hostages are still in Gaza, then it means that everybody has not done enough. Maybe including the forum. I don't know, although we don't have that much leverage. More has to be done and more can be done. I have no doubt that the Biden administration has done a lot. I don't know what will happen with the change of administration. I know from an Israeli point of view that the military professionals for many months now have said that they have no problem with a hostage deal that would mean ending hostilities, at least for now. It's a political decision, and that political decision hasn't been made until today. And if ever the phrase "time is of the essence" was meaningful, it is now, because every day that passes, every single day, might mean that the list of living hostages grows smaller, shorter.
Absolutely. Ambassador Daniel Sheikh, thank you so much for your insight today. As you said, time is of the essence, so let's hope the hostages are returned home as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And authorities in Brazil are opening a war crimes investigation into an IDF soldier who served in Gaza as he vacationed in the country. He was alerted to the inquiry and fled Brazil. It's one of several cases happening across the world where IDF reservists are being targeted for serving in Gaza. ILTV's Shosh Bedrosian is outside the Curia with the latest.
Well, an urgent meeting is being held today by the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee regarding the possibility of legal prosecution some IDF soldiers might face abroad. Of course, this all comes after Brazilian officials opened an investigation into an IDF soldier that was visiting the country. An IDF soldier has officially escaped Brazil, according to reports, after an arrest warrant was issued by the Brazilian federal court to investigate him for alleged war crimes they say he committed while serving in Gaza. The IDF soldier is a Nova Festival survivor who ran kilometers from Hamas on October 7th. He served in Gaza after the massacre. The initial complaint was spearheaded by an organization called the Heinz Rajab Foundation, whose mission, according to their X profile, is, quote, devoted to ending Israeli impunity. They accuse the soldier of, quote, participating in massive demolitions of civilian homes in Gaza. They say they have evidence of the soldier, his geolocation data, and photos of him. It's not the first time an IDF soldier was targeted abroad. Chilean lawyers are demanding an arrest warrant to be issued for an IDF soldier traveling the country for alleged war crimes. A defense attorney at the International Criminal Court says if a soldier is arrested abroad, they must request a visit from the Israeli consul. He also says soldiers who share videos online of their service are at greater risk of legal action, but simply serving in Gaza is not enough for investigations to be opened up into them.
Israeli officials say they're witnessing a systemic and anti-Semitic campaign aimed at denying Israel's right to self-defense. They believe that international actors in other countries are part of this effort.
Shosh, thank you for the report, a concerning trend. And joining us now with more on the outrageous investigations into alleged war crimes of IDF soldiers abroad is Arsen Ostrovsky, CEO of the International Legal Forum, a global coalition of lawyers defending Israel and IDF soldiers abroad, and also a senior fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security. Arsen, always wonderful to have you on.
Thank you.
So the incident in Brazil, where an IDF soldier has been identified and accused of war crimes, this has been the fear of the Israeli government ever since the ICC and the ICJ cases against Israel. Has this now set a global precedent for other countries to follow?
Look, that remains to be seen. Certainly what we saw in Brazil is very disconcerting. It is, I think, fair to say, an obscene travesty of justice that an individual who survived the Hamas massacre at the Nova Festival would now be hounded in Brazil. And we also have to be mindful and remember that the organization, the Hind Rajab Foundation, that is hounding Israeli soldiers around the world in Europe and Brazil and Thailand and elsewhere, has some very extremist and disconcerting roots. The founder, the person that heads up the organization, was a proud member of Hezbollah, and they've also mourned the elimination of October 7 mastermind and former Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. But I think this is ultimately part of a long-standing lawfare campaign by Palestinian groups and their supporters around the world to politicize and weaponize the law against Israelis.
Against Israelis, does this mean that it's no longer safe for IDF reservists to travel abroad?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily not safe for them to travel, but I think one of the consequences will be that certainly those Israelis will be more Israeli soldiers, those currently still in service, I suppose, and those that have just come out of service, will be a lot more mindful in terms of which destinations they choose to travel to. Certainly not some of these countries that are entertaining the Palestinian campaigns against them. So I think that will certainly be ought to be in their mind.
So far Israel has been able to stay ahead of this incident in Brazil, but that may not always be the case looking forward. From an international law perspective, what can you tell us about this specific incident in Brazil? Israel has been accused of war crimes and of genocide, but those cases are largely falling apart. So how can Brazil simply decide to open an investigation into an Israeli reservist?
I think we also have to put this in context. The organization, Hind Rajab Foundation, that is initiating this tidal wave of claims, which numbers, I believe, over 1,000 at this point. Not a single one of them has actually resulted in an arrest or an Israeli individual being detained abroad. I think that's important to bear in mind. Look, different countries, different jurisdictions have different legal procedures where individuals or NGOs can submit claims, such as in Brazil. It is then up to the country and their authorities, whether it's the Attorney General's office or the political echelon, to determine whether an investigation can proceed or not, and ultimately whether a warrant can be issued or not. But most of these, if not, I would say all of these claims that are being waged and filed against Israelis are entirely baseless and without merit, and I think that also explains why they have not resulted in any actual warrants or arrests thus far. But what they do represent, however, a very drastic concern, I suppose, in terms of Israel's diplomatic relations with these countries that entertain these warrants. There's also questions to be had for the incoming Trump administration, which has already said for example, with the ICC, that they will unleash a fury of sanctions, and whether they will apply this similarly to those countries that are seeking to acquiesce to these lawfare demands to exploit the law against Israeli officers and soldiers, whether to sanction some of these countries that agreed to, I suppose, play along with this charade.
All right, well, Arsen, thank you so much for your insight today on this important issue.
My pleasure.
And moving on, it's day 458 of the war in Gaza. And today, Hamas fired 3 rockets from northern Gaza at the town of Sderot. One rocket managed to penetrate defenses and caused minor damage to a home. No injuries were reported. Meanwhile, the IDF is focusing its operations on preventing renewed Hamas rocket fire and attempted resurgence in recent weeks. The IDF carried out a drone strike on Hamas operatives in Gaza's humanitarian zone. The compound was used by terrorists to plan and carry out attacks on troops in Gaza and against Israel. The Air Force conducted a separate strike that targeted and killed an Islamic Jihad company commander who took part in the October 7th massacre. Sahat Danon was targeted and killed by the IDF forces. The second operative who was with him was carrying an explosive device. He was captured and taken to Israel for questioning. And one by one, Israel is reaching all the Hamas terrorists involved in the October 7th massacre. Meanwhile, intense efforts are reportedly underway in negotiations to reach an extension of the ceasefire in Lebanon, set to expire on January 26th. Lebanon has so far failed to deploy the agreed-upon number of Lebanese troops south of the Litani to clear out Hezbollah. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz has the story.
President Biden's special envoy Amos Hochstein is due in the region, trying to reach a Lebanon ceasefire extension before the Trump administration takes office on January 20th. Israeli and American officials want to avoid a return to full-scale war in the north. The Security Cabinet considered the situation and wants permanent guarantees of the removal of Hezbollah north of the Litani River. This as the IDF continues to make efforts on the ground in South Lebanon to remove or destroy remaining weaponry. The current notion is to keep IDF forces inside Lebanon beyond the 60 days to ensure that the Lebanese army has fully deployed and Hezbollah fully removed. Hochstein was the architect of the ceasefire deal and is working to see it preserved. He will chair a meeting to discuss the ongoing implementation alongside Major General Jasper Jeffers from U.S. Central Command and Lebanese military and political leaders. One possibility is a 30-day extension of the ceasefire agreement. The IDF has withdrawn from a few towns in South Lebanon that have been successfully disarmed and are now controlled by the Lebanese army. The vision is that eventually the IDF would be able to withdraw fully from South Lebanon. At the same time, Defense Minister Katz is warning Hezbollah of the severe consequences if it fails to withdraw beyond the Litani. Katz said, if there is no withdrawal, there is no agreement. Elsewhere in the northern front, the IDF has been operating on the Syrian Hermon. Troops searched military structures and destroyed former Syrian army weapons. The weaponry included explosives, anti-tank missiles, rocket launchers, and rockets.
And there are still tens of thousands of Israelis who have been evacuated from their homes in the north. Many have already set up new lives in central and southern Israel, rented homes, sent their kids to new schools, and so on. But now, after over a year, the government has announced a new plan to bring them back home to the north. The Finance Ministry has announced a new plan to provide financial benefits and incentives for the residents of northern Israel to return to their homes beginning on March 1st. Tens of thousands of Israelis have still been unable to return home after being evacuated from the north following the October 7th massacre in 2023 and Hezbollah's near-daily attacks against northern Israel. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and member of Knesset Zev Elkin, who leads the northern rehabilitation efforts, announced a 3.4 billion shekel plan at a press conference this week. Smotrich said the key to returning home is security and said that the residents would be returning to a new security reality. The 60-day ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah is holding for now, and efforts are underway to ensure it remains permanent. But Smotrich added that this financial plan would be based on new security assessments that would be made after U.S. President-elect Trump takes office and at the end of the 60-day ceasefire period. As part of the plan, residents will receive 2 grants, one to assist with the financial burdens of their return home, and the second a property stipend for the homes that have been abandoned for over a year. The aim is to incentivize residents, many of whom have relocated and set up new lives in central Israel, to return home to the north. And with less than 2 weeks until Trump's inauguration, major shifts in Senate leadership and U.S.-Israel relations are already making headlines. Maayan Hoffman is standing by near the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem to break it down.
Thank you, Lidar. There are less than 2 weeks until U.S. President Donald Trump is inaugurated, and already there are some major shakeups in the Senate. John Thune has taken over for Senator Mitch McConnell, who resigned after nearly 2 decades in his position. Now, Thune is going to be running a Republican majority Senate, although admittedly it's by a small margin. One of Thune's first priorities will be confirming President Trump's nominees for top administration roles. Among them are former Governor Mike Huckabee, slated to become U.S. ambassador to Israel, and Morgan Ortagus, who was nominated over the weekend to serve as deputy Mideast envoy. While Huckabee's nomination is widely supported, some of Trump's selections have sparked debate within the Republican ranks. In the House, Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana was re-elected Speaker on Friday. A strong supporter of Israel, Johnson led the House in approving $14 billion in aid to Israel last spring. Speaking of arms, reports in American media suggest President Biden plans to finalize a significant arms package for Israel before leaving office. This deal reportedly includes heavy bombs, precision munitions, artillery shells, and fighter jet supplies. Some of these weapons, especially the heavy bombs, could take months or even years to produce and deliver due to concerns about civilian impact in Gaza. The State Department has already informed Congress of the proposal. Just 5 weeks ago, after the Lebanon ceasefire, Biden approved a $680 million arms package for Israel and hinted at more support on the way. Now, Lidar, there were efforts by liberal Democrats to block the arms transfer, but they were defeated by a bipartisan majority. It's a big statement from the administration in its final hour, and certainly by President Biden himself, who has called himself a Zionist. It's also hopefully a foreshadowing of what is to come: strong and consistent bipartisan support for the state of Israel.
Thank you, Maayan. Absolutely. Let's hope this is a good sign of what's to come with regards to both Republican and Democrat support for Israel. We open today with news of a terrorist attack in which 3 people were murdered and 6 others wounded, one seriously as Palestinian terrorists opened fire at a bus and several vehicles near Kedumim in Judea and Samaria. The victims include 2 women in their 60s and a policeman in his 40s. The 63-year-old bus driver remains in serious condition. The attack was carried out on a main road which is shared by both Israelis and Palestinians. So much for claims of apartheid. Security forces rushed to the scene and launched a manhunt for the attackers, believed to include more than 1 terrorist. Following the attack, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a statement offering condolences to the families of the victims and pledged that Israel will reach the despicable murderers and bring them to justice, along with everyone who helped them. He added, no one will be spared. And the emotional highs and lows of reported progress in the hostage for ceasefire talks have reached new levels of cruelty for the families of those 100 Israelis still being held captive by Hamas in Gaza. A Saudi news outlet today published the names of 34 hostages to allegedly be returned, without indicating which of the hostages are living and which are dead. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz tries to separate fact from fiction.
The cruel rumor mill connected with the hostage for ceasefire agreement is working overtime. A Saudi newspaper today published a list of captives to be freed, but does not differentiate between the living and the dead. The list includes the 2 Bibas children, 10 women, 11 older men, and 11 men under age 50. Earlier, a news report by Reuters said Hamas had approved the list of 34 Israeli hostages to be released in the first phase of the deal. Shortly after that report gained momentum, the Prime Minister's office denied that any such list has been received. The report went on to quote Hamas, saying the deal was still contingent on reaching an agreement for an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a permanent ceasefire. Prime Minister Netanyahu convened key ministers amid reports of progress in the talks. A Saudi report quotes sources saying an agreement could be clinched on key issues before Donald Trump takes office on January 20th. Indeed, there's speculation that the agreement could still be reached in the final days of the Biden administration. Secretary of State Blinken has been encouraging that speculation. A Palestinian source told a Qatari newspaper that the coming days would be decisive for hostage talks in Doha. Israeli officials say they still doubt that Hamas will agree to release all of the hostages in a second and third phase of a potential agreement unless Israel guarantees an end to the war. Israel has made no such commitment.
And joining us now with more on the hostage negotiations is Ambassador Daniel Sheikh, head of diplomacy at the Forum of the Families of the Hostages. Thank you so much for joining us today. You know, this is really an emotional roller coaster, especially for the families of the hostages. It seems every time we're close to a deal, every time the media reports on a deal, at the very last moment, Hamas backs out. You know, is this a deliberate strategy on their part to try and demoralize Israelis, demoralize the families, part of, you know, the psychological warfare?
You know, I have enough trouble figuring out the position of the Israeli government, so it's really difficult for me to do the same for the Hamas leadership. Obviously, they are not the most convenient negotiating partners that we could